Well, hello everyone, Stuckery here.
And I'm Gabby.
And welcome back to the podcast, my host. If you're literally watching this on the History of Everything podcast YouTube channel, then hey, welcome. Congrats for actually seeing us in our beautiful faces. You can't quite tell yet. We are planning on upgrading the camera that is going into all this, because right now it's a good webcam, mind you, but it is going to get better. What we're doing right now, though, is having a little bit of a conversation in a freezing cold garage.
It's 20 degrees outside. Our garage is not insulated, so this is fun.
Yeah.
I'm having a lot of fun.
For anyone that may not be as aware of what that is in freedom Fahrenheit units, that's like negative, 5 degrees Celsius? Around there?
I'm not sure.
-5, -6, somewhere around there. It's below 0 degrees Celsius. I know that for a fact. Yeah, it's cold, but we have stories to tell about a place that is even colder. Today, we're going to be talking about an event that was quite literally one of the biggest parties that you could have ever had in history. I say party. It's not exactly a party. It is a party. It is an event. It is a showcase. It is literally every word you could possibly use to describe some kind of monumentous event. This is that and more. Because what I'm talking about here today is the architect Daniel Hudson Burnham and the Chicago World Fair. Which, out of curiosity, Gabby, do you know what a World Fair is in the first place? Because it's like this
An
big
exhibition.
Yeah,
from
that's the word.
Countries around the world. Everybody knows what a World Fair is.
I was messing up the whole thing with exhibitions. That was the word that I was trying to remember. Was exhibit? Thank you. That is exactly what it is that I needed.
Maybe it's my podcast now. Maybe I'm gonna tell the story.
Well, I mean, eventually, when you have your own lore podcast, that is going to be a thing. Because
Don't spoil it. They don't know.
So
It'll be unveiled later.
Spoiler: she's planning on doing her own thing. That's all I'm going to say on that. But the gist of what we're talking about is the World Fair, this exhibition, this massive, massive event that brought together something like, I think, 54 countries across the world in a multi-million-dollar event. Millions upon millions of people went and viewed this thing. It was ridiculous. So many different inventors, inventions, like cultural artifacts, like everything occurred here. And so we wanted to go ahead and tell that story because all of this takes place in a very rapidly transforming time that I really wanted to talk about because it's just so much fun. See, this is the early 1890s, right? America at this point, it's not a world power. It's not, it's a power, right? But it's not a world power. That wasn't going to happen for a couple more decades. Literally 30 years prior to this, they were in the middle of, the American Civil War. The country itself was tearing itself apart.
You are tearing me apart, Lisa!
At this point, horses were the widest use thing for transportation. Cars were invented. They did have cars, but they sucked. You remember seeing those old images of like the cars that you'd have to like crank up
The
and
little
everything?
crank cars, yeah.
Right. Now imagine that, but even more bare bones to that it almost looks like a shopping cart, but it has an engine in it.
Interesting.
I'm not even kidding. Like you look at the first early cars, it literally looks like someone took a wagon or a cart and just stuck an engine onto it that you had to crank up. I also say dangerous, but they literally only went like, I'm not even kidding, 3 or 4 miles per hour.
Can you have just ridden that bike?
I mean, yeah.
Like at that point, just ride a bike. The horse can go faster.
Bicycles were also becoming more of a thing at this time, though it wasn't as big of a deal.
It had to go more than 3 or 4 miles per hour, or
Some
nobody
did.
would buy it.
Some did. Well, people bought it specifically for the luxury. Like, we're going to get into this. Why do rich people buy things, Gabby?
They can.
You answered your own question right there.
I
Literally.
personally would not waste my money on that. 3 or 4 miles an hour. I could run. I could just run that fast.
Yeah, but it's the novelty of it. Some of them would go like 7 or 8 miles per hour, but really, they were... most of them were not capable of going faster than a brisk walk. But we're saying we're getting a little bit early into this.
Let's get into it. Like, America was not a superpower. Horses were widely used. Let's go.
So America's not a real big superpower at this point. It's not even a superpower. It's just a power at this point. Horses are the most widely form of transportation that are used. And then the biggest form of communication that you have here is the telegraph. I mean, the telephone was invented like 10 years or so, 15 years prior to this, but the telegraph is really the big way that people are able to communicate because, again, like the whole thing with the car, the telephone was something that the rich people would have.
Okay, but here's the thing, right?
Yeah.
I know what a telephone is, and I know what a telegraph is. It's kind of a letter, but not really.
Yeah.
How did those work?
Electrical signals.
Okay, so was it like Morse code? They kind of
that's
sending
literally
letters
what it is. Yes, that literally
over
was
a
Morse code.
line. So they're just sending tapping sounds, and you'll transcribe it and then send that to the person it was meant for.
Yes.
Okay, so that's kind of what I thought it was, but I never looked into it. I just kind of was like, yeah, this is what a telegraph is, but I'm not 100% sure.
That is literally what it was. It was just the sending of electrical signals to make a beeping noise, basically. It was something that would create a sound effect on the other side that would allocate for, like, a quick beep, a long beep, etc. Which there's a specific term that they use when talking about Morse code, and I can't remember what it was, like the long versus short beep. Didn't it not have a specific name, like for what they would call it? I cannot remember.
They called it Morse code.
Well, I know, but it's like what the individual names that you know what I'm talking about there. I don't know.
I don't know.
But
anyway, so they communicated by telegraph.
everything was changing. We're talking warfare. We're talking everything is evolving. Now, at the point we're still having horseback, like cavalry was still something that was used in the Civil War. It just
Cavalry?
Yeah.
Like with swords?
Yeah, with swords. And in some cases, spears. Like lancers were still a thing, but that was primarily with some European armies. And it was usually honor guards. The gist is a lot of stuff is changing. This is this weird transitionary period between the old and the new. The United States population to this point is like 65 million people, and it's really eager to prove itself as something that is much greater than what people really thought of it. Like, it was the up and coming power. It wanted to be able to do more. And the way that you did that in the 1800s was, I mean, you pretty much had two ways. One, you win a really big major war and you show the world just how awesome you are, or you show off things through a world fair.
Look what I can do.
Which the world fair was the easily more accessible thing that didn't rely on copious amounts of death in order to do.
I like the war one. It would have been way more
Wait,
flashy.
hold on.
Way more flashy. I'm
Yeah.
joking. I'm obviously joking.
I like the war when she's okay. I see where you're going here. Just prior to this, right, in the 1890s, like 1899, you had France, which put on its own World Fair, right? So they had done, not World Fair exactly, but what they did is they put on this massive event with the unveiling of the Eiffel Tower, right? So for people who may be confused about when the Eiffel Tower came into being, that literally was in the late 1800s here. It's not really all that old. Like, I thought when I was first, learning about the Eiffel Tower and whatnot, that was back in like the 1850s or was earlier, perhaps. Right around the time post-Napoleonic, etc. France is at peace, wants to create that. Nope. It is the height of the 1800s, like towards the end, and they just want to put on something really big and show just how awesome they are. This is actually the first time that the safety elevator, which was invented by a guy called Elijah Otis, was made. So it was used specifically for this event, and that is still used to this day.
When you say safety
Naturally.
elevator, just an elevator or an elevator for safety?
Well, like, okay,
What
so
is the...
So you know how there are elevators that are literally lifts that would raise things up and down from the ground, like you elevate something?
Yeah.
So a safety elevator would be like a passenger elevator.
Okay, so it's just an elevator
Yeah,
for
well, we would
people.
call just an elevator, but before that you would have had something that would have been a lift, something that would have been used to specifically raise goods to and from positions.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So the first elevator.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's like the first elevator. This is being used at that time. And the reaction to this was so massive. Not just the elevator, but the Eiffel Tower, the events, the culture, everything. That the United States wanted to go and create their own thing. They wanted to do something big. So they turned to Congress, and Congress does what Congress does best. I'm not going to get political on anything from this. This applies regardless of what side of anything you support. Can you guess what it is that Congress did?
They said they'll work on it, and they didn't actually work on it, and it got forgotten about, and it took forever to get approved. Am I close?
Yeah, you are pretty damn close.
Here's
Basically,
the thing.
they didn't
Congress
do
gets a
anything.
bad rap, but I work at a company that is not even like a multi-location corporation. And to get one thing approved, You have to go, hey, can we get this approved? Yeah, I'll bring it up in a meeting. Okay, cool. 2 weeks later, did you bring it up in the meeting? Yeah, I brought it up. They said they'll work on it. Okay, 2 weeks later, hey, any movement on this? No, we'll circle back in the next month's meeting. Okay, we circled back in the next month's meeting. Hey, what do you think? I don't know. Let's see. Let's vote on it. We might revisit this next week. Okay, we revisit it next week. Can you write up like a proposal? I thought this was the proposal. I thought we were talking about it already. Anyway, this is a really long way to say.
You just described government.
Bureaucracy occurs at every level.
Yeah, exactly. Bureaucracy, government, it all does the same thing. They basically took forever to do anything because the first question, of course, they had is, where was this going to be hosted? All right. This was to be determined by the U.S. Congress, and just like anything else that they do, it took forever to actually decide where it was going to be, right? They could agree. The only thing they really agreed upon in the beginning is that they wanted it to be on the 400th anniversary of Columbus's landing in the New World. So this thing was going to be called the World Columbian Exposition.
Columbus?
Yeah.
Okay.
Hey, colonizer.
Gabby, it's literally the 1890s.
All I said is Columbus?
It is literally the 1890s. You gotta understand. It is literally, I know. Okay.
Oh, no. People who don't like me, they're going to be like, she's so political. I hate her.
For anyone who doesn't understand
I just said okay.
If you see her on YouTube right now, please understand she is literally Trinidadian. Like, her people had a way more personal involvement with Columbus than many would have.
But okay, so the Columbus landing in the New World. Okay.
So yes, this whole thing is based off, Columbus landing in the New World and all that. And this different cities are competing with one another as to who is going to end up being the host of this, right? And due to special interest groups, the corruption, lobbying, how a good and healthy democracy really gets things going. That's exactly how it goes. They're all pushing for their city to specifically get chosen, right? And in the end, Chicago wins. And this was largely due to the maneuvering and the influence of Chicago's mayor, a guy by the name of Carter Harrison III. So Chicago had been a city that was on the rise for decades. It wasn't the biggest, right? At least it wasn't up until this point. Traditionally, the two biggest cities in the United States were Philadelphia and New York, which would typically alternate between which one was the biggest and arguably then most important city in the United States. And usually they would determine this based off its industrial output as well as population, right? And in the 1890 census, Chicago surpassed Philadelphia by 50,000 people with a population of 1.1 million. Now, that may not sound all too crazy, but this was a city that was founded in 1837. So to grow that quickly, like the level of growth that it experienced was insane. So for several decades, this was the fastest growing city in the entire world. Both its economy, its influence, everything was skyrocketing since the 1870s. And it was the leader in many different fields, including manufacturing, retail, finance, transportation. Oh, it was huge on transportation too. Like, Chicago is still to this day the rail hub. Like, if you know how there's that joke.
I thought that was New York City.
No. New York may be a cultural hub, but it's like, how there's that joke about Atlanta being the airport hub. Like, somehow.
No, Atlanta's just a nightmare.
Yeah, we know that, but it's still like the hub that all the things end up going to when it comes to aircraft.
Oh, if you're in Atlanta, I'm so sorry. I just really hate your roads.
No, the roads, every time we would drive through, I understand. But like, Chicago is and was to railroads what Atlanta was to airports. It was the big one that essentially every kind of middleway traffic through the United States would go through. And in the case of Chicago, this was something that by 1910, there was over 20 railroads that conducted passenger services through 6 different downtown terminals. It was so big on industrialization there that all these railroads were connecting out from the outer lying states to drive their goods towards Chicago as a central hub that would then be able to put everything elsewhere. And so we're talking something for money and influence. That is huge for them. Their influence was so big that it was actually from Chicago that you have the standardized time system that began.
In Chicago?
It's Chicago.
So
and its railroad system.
US or standardized
world.
For the world.
For the world.
So
because they're the ones that started it and it became a thing.
When we say it's our rail, like the rail hub, was it just like impressive for the U.S. because Europe uses way more public transportation. So for Chicago to have that title, it's a little bit insulting.
For goods.
Okay, that makes a lot
For
of
goods,
sense.
like the sheer amount of goods that were moving, because the United States at this point was rapidly up and coming as a both agricultural and manufacturing powerhouse. Really, with the rise with World War I, that is when it would truly achieve its king status, because that is when, of course, the entire world is having to buy American goods in order to supply their troops, supply their people, supply everything. So that's really where it becomes dominant, like the king, but it was rapidly rising up until this point, because prior to that, it was, well, not exactly prior to that, but decades before, it was mostly still agricultural. Like there was manufacturing industries, but it was really going into the mid, like past 1850s, 1860s, like the American Civil War. Industrialization had already been picking up in the North and then just skyrocketed after that. It was just on a massive upwards trajectory. So these railroads and their managers and the influence they had was so ridiculous that in 1883, that's when they developed the standard time zones in North America, and everyone just accepted it
and changed their clocks.
They literally just accepted it. Yeah, that's exactly what happened. I mean, due to all the railroad management needs, these guys were so influential, they could literally change how time worked.
Well, I mean, if you're relying on these people to get you supplies everywhere, around the entire country and other parts of the world, you'll go, yeah, absolutely, I'll change my time for you, I guess, if you just get me that pizza.
So you know how Chicago deep dish pizza. yeah, his thing. There's the pun for it. So you know how like this is how big it was, and one of the big driving things behind some of its initial growth, meat packing. Do you remember how you remember cowboys, right?
No, what's a cowboy?
Okay. And I'm not talking like I'm not talking the Hollywood Western. You're looking at me like it's a stupid question. I know. But I'm not talking about the Hollywood, like Clint Eastwood cowboy.
No, the cowboys
thing.
that actually got the cattle where they needed to go. They transported them. That was their whole purpose. And it was a huge part of American like meat industry.
Correct. So for anyone who's not aware, right, cowboys, it's not that stereotypical image that you associate of this like kind of rugged looking, handsome white guy with 5 o'clock shadow. Okay, yes, there's some that were, but the ones that you typically saw, those guys were usually not the cowboys. Those were the guards of the caravan that were escorting the cowboys and everyone else northward, because out of Oklahoma, Texas, and all these other regions there in like the Southwest, you have massive cattle ranches. And so every year the cowboys, which were primarily like black and Hispanic workers, like it was a huge...
They whitewashed cowboys?
Kind of, yeah. Because the image around cowboys, like the showing off like rodeos, that initial whole thing is a mixed culture between like Southern white ranchers and the Hispanic traditions, like the Mexican traditions. So that whole thing is what created rodeo culture.
I'm in shock right now.
Right?
I would have never thought. I mean, there were like in obviously I guess the time period these movies were made, there was like the occasional person of color.
Yeah. Well, so those, remember how they showed the different people as gunslingers?
Yeah.
And called them cowboys? The gunslingers were largely the white ones. Like the ones who would serve as the guards, the ones who would be going in with like the adventurers, the outlaws, I would say the outlaws, there was all kinds of different outlaws from among there, but the ones who primarily would have weapons as part of the caravan, those cowboys, that is like the image. But the ones who were typically driving the cattle
and actually taking care of that
were mostly the Hispanic and African workers.
Interesting.
And even then, it was largely like there was a huge Hispanic population that was doing this. So what they would do is they would drive. I know we're going off on a big tangent on this.
Great. No,
I could do an entire podcast dedicated to cowboys from this.
Please do. I'm learning so much.
But like what they would do is they would start in these southern locations and then they would drive them up northwards, and then they would drive them until they reached a rail line, because from that rail line they would load the cattle. The cattle would head north to Chicago. They would get processed in the slaughterhouses and then from the slaughterhouses, the meatpacking plants. From the meatpacking plants, the Chicago was the central hub that it would distribute it everywhere. And so over time, what happened, the death of cowboys did not come from large amounts of people moving in to the West or anything like that. The death of cowboys came from the time that railroads expanded to such a point at this time period
That they could just take the cattle.
that they could just take the cattle
Okay.
like 50 yards down the road and just load it onto the rail.
I just got really sad because can you imagine your first time on a rail, like a train, is just to go get killed? I'm really sad about that. That's so sad. These cows probably thought they were having the best time of their life. They're like, wow, I'm going on an adventure. And then their dinner. That makes me really sad. Anyway.
The short of it, I've gone on several long tangents at this point.
That was
and
a
I
cool
know
one.
this is going to be a long podcast. I'm telling you this right now. This is a big podcast. This is something that a lot of the research in here came from our podcast producer and editor, James. And I know for a fact that we're going to end up recording this in 2 sessions. It's going to go out as one big
Or you
podcast
go out
episode.
as two.
Could it?
Part 1 and part 2.
We could do a part 1,
But
part.
like
It depends. It depends.
Patreon can get 2 parts one
They
time.
would probably get both parts
Yeah.
at the same time for when that goes out. Yeah, you're right. Which, if you're not a member of Patreon, hey, just a heads up, $1 a month, extra episodes, early access to episodes. It's nice. It's nice. Definitely join.
Shameless plug. Anyway.
Shameless plug. Anyway, moving on. Talking about Chicago again. Chicago was this big up-and-coming city, as we said. It was one of the worldwide leaders in public sanitation and preventative health. In 1856, the city built the first comprehensive sewage system in the United States. In order to do this, this literally involved raising much of central Chicago up to a completely new grade using jack screws. They literally had to raise up the buildings as they needed. Like, you ever hear about this with cities and they talk about how, oh, they're doing these archaeology excavations on these sections of a city and they're finding like entire buildings that are underground and all this stuff.
Yeah.
Did you ever wonder as a kid, like, how the hell are all these buildings just underground? Why how does that work?
I guess they raised the city at some point.
Over time, what would happen is people would literally just build cities on top of other cities. So the further down you dig in some of these sites of ancient cities, you will literally find, yes, here is the like you go into southern Italy in spots like that. And it's like, okay, here is the Victorian era. Oh, here is the medieval period. Oh, here is the level below that. Now we have the Arabic side for like in southern Sicily where that was taken over by the Arabs. Go below that, and then you have like the Byzantine and the Roman and everything. Like, you just dig further down, you're going to find artifacts the deeper you go that is that level. So in this case, they raised the city upwards in order to build a sewer system underneath it. And the whole thing is just raised up. Now, that being said, a little bit of a pun that I'm about to do here because it's bad. But I have to say it.
Maybe don't say it.
No, I have to. I have to. A couple years later, after they do this, the city would be raised in a whole different way.
The Great Chicago Fire.
The Great Chicago Fire.
1871.
Yeah. For anyone who doesn't know that, that's raised.
Well-
If you raise something to the ground, that's burning it. So that's
You're funny.
that's
Nate.
my pun for today.
You're
I'm just
so
doing it.
funny. I promise. They
That's
laughed.
my pun. They laughed. Yeah, and they may be. I'm probably getting so many dislikes on this video as it goes out right now onto YouTube. But all right, so in 1871, right, you have the Great Chicago Fire. This destroys a huge section of the city, and then out of the ashes, Chicago starts to just grow even more rapidly. Its architectural communities, its engineering communities, everything just becomes huge, and it becomes known worldwide. Like, this is a big thing. This is much in the same way that it would work like in the case of a forest fire. Like, when you have a old forest with a whole bunch of trees, and if those trees don't fall eventually, the forest underneath it dies. Like the shrubs, like all the plants. Like, do you remember this from ecology class? Do they ever cover that with like what happens where people are trying to protect and stop logging, and where logging is actually good in some cases in a controlled method for forests?
Yes.
So one of the unfortunate things that happens in ecology, for anyone that may be a bit confused, is that when a lot of species within forests have died that perhaps would before have felled trees and removed different things or have natural burnings, if you continuously put out fires in a forest and don't let some kind of fire or something occur, eventually you will have a fire that will eventually destroy the entire forest because it's just old, decrepit, bad wood. So out of the ashes of forest fires, you typically see much better, healthier growth. And that same thing
Because
happens
it's
with the city.
fertilizing it. Like if you wanted slash and burn.
Yeah, it's fertilizer.
It's not great, but it worked because of that.
And all of the seeds from the other plants that were down below now have a fighting chance to get actual sunlight, whereas before the trees would have blocked it. So in the case of Chicago, yeah, a bunch of people died and a lot of the city was destroyed.
You can't just say, a bunch of people died.
A bunch of people. Welcome to
say that.
history.
You
A
can't
bunch
say
of people died.
I'm so sorry. You have to say, oh no, it's very sad.
I have a feeling that is the precise thing that's going to end up being put in the TikTok that we're going to create out of this, which is a bunch of people died, but don't worry, it got better. Literally. So much like the case of the forest fire, a bunch of the city gets burned down. And so that what they're able to do is replace all of these old, decrepit wooden structures that before were in the city as part of its rapid growth period with new steel and concrete constructions, like stuff that was significantly sturdier and bigger. We're not talking about 1 or 2 story buildings that are just spread outwards. We're talking about the creation of skyscrapers. This is really where the skyscraper was popularized. And this was all done by a guy called the name of Louis Sullivan is his name. Louis Sullivan. And there was a thing I saw in this here as a note. And if you look up a picture of him, so go ahead and look up Louis Sullivan. Look him up right now, Gabby. And for anyone that looks like this, the weird thing is he kind of looks like James if James lost a bit of weight.
It's-a me.
I'm not even kidding when I say that.
Oh my gosh, it does.
Because I looked him up. And I was shocked.
James is the podcast producer, by the way.
Yeah, he's the guy that helped in a bunch of the notes.
Or Louis Sullivan's long lost great grandson.
Hold on, if it's that many greats, that means that those
I
people
don't
were
know.
getting it on. This is like 100 years ago.
Okay, so great.
Maybe. I would hope so, because otherwise you're popping out kids every 14 to 16 years if it's that many greats.
It could happen.
You know, in some cases it may. Yeah. But anyway, all of this is to say that Chicago was developing a big reputation. For decades, the city had dominated the meatpacking industries. It was turning out 12 million cattle and hogs a year by the 1890s. Now, of course, that perhaps pales into comparison to what we're talking about with, say, the modern meatpacking industry in general, like Tyson and its war on chickens and everything. But you have to remember, for a population in total of 65 million people in the entire U.S., that this many cattle are being processed in a time that is before the big population booms and everything that would become decades later. This is really big. That's a huge amount. In 1871, you had a guy by the name of Gustavus Swift, and he had developed refrigerated railroad cars, which completely changed things because now you were able to have massive industrial centers in one location that could ship food and products elsewhere. So you could concentrate all this industry in one space. Before, if you didn't process something locally,
it would go bad.
It would go
bad.
bad.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I never thought of that.
Exactly. So with the invention of refrigerated railroad cars, that is literally one of the biggest, most defining moments of the food industry and just being able to transport things. Like that's huge. And so this changed the meatpacking industry. It elevated the Union stockyards and the transit company to become the nationwide nexus that essentially all meatpacking went through.
So basically, Chicago was a really big deal.
Chicago was a really big deal. And so it's because of that they wanted to do something big. I know that we basically talked now for like 20 minutes or so about how big of a deal.
28 minutes. It's been half an hour. So sorry.
Spent half an hour just talking about how big of a deal Chicago was.
Feel free to cut all of this out.
Okay.
No, don't. There have been some good rants with this one, mind you. But the gist is, we really need to establish why Chicago was becoming such a big deal before it itself wanted to put it on the map for the world. So they wanted to do something big. And with plans to create the world's largest spectacle, like something that had never been seen before, they went and set up a commission that could start this massive project. This was going to be called the Columbian Exposition, and they decided to appoint a man by the name of Daniel H. Burnham as the director of the works that was in charge of the entire thing. So Burnham had made his name in previous architectural endeavors by the early use of high-rise buildings, by using architecture and sculpture and different things to create beauty for buildings, for city, for like stuff that was structurally very impressive to look at. He wanted to create essentially an entire city. Not something that was just tents, not something that was like little stands that were set up. No. This thing was going to be an entire new city within a city that people could just walk into. The future of humanity. Something like walking into a city that was in the clouds. Something that the entire thing was going to be so decorated that it would earn the name the White City. Because it was brilliantly colored and like bright and shiny. And we're going to get into that because this is also talking about the first mass use of electricity for stuff. It is insane. But in order to bring about this structure, this grandeur, this amazement that was out of the chaos, Burnham was going to need to assemble the greatest collection of builders, architects, artisans, everything that you possibly could from around the world. So to name just a few of these guys, you have a person by the name of John Root, who was Burnham's longtime partner and architectural genius. If Burnham was the guy who was just a good architect, his biggest strength was in being able to deal with and organize people, putting them at ease. Root, on the other hand, was the visionary, the man who would see something like an empty plot of bare land and would just imagine a massive complex on it, like skyscrapers, everything. He was the guy who wanted to create and do everything. He was the heart and soul of Burnham's team and would play a very significant role in designing a bunch of the really awe-inspiring features that would be seen at the fair. But unfortunately, he died very early on in the project due to pneumonia, which threw a whole bunch of this planning that they were preparing for out of the way. And so knowing that he was not going to be able to do all of this on his own, Burnham went and gathered just a massive team together that would be like the Avengers or the Justice League of architects, which sounds so dumb to say, but literally, this is supposed to be the world's biggest spectacle, something never before seen. And so they were getting the best from like the western parts of America, the best from like the eastern parts, from all the different cities that were being rapidly constructed all over the world. He wanted to create something amazing. So one of the biggest features was a guy by the name of Frederick Law Olmsted, who was the father of landscape architecture. At least modern landscape architecture. So when I'm describing landscape architecture, you know what I'm talking about, right? When you go to those big parks and you see like the rolling hills and everything in such a way that it's like before it was a flat, empty piece of ground, but then they built it in such a way that it becomes
you see
more.
It on a lot of estates too. So like if
Yes.
someone has a really fancy house, their garden or their yard is going to be majestic.
Exactly.
So, yeah.
Yes. He was the guy that was the father of developing those massive projects, but for cities, like the big city parks. He is the guy that designed Central Park in New York. So that's him. He's the guy
I
that
knew he sounded familiar.
Yep. He did Central Park. He did the Biltmore Estate, which was the home of the Vanderbilt family. Huge thing. If you've ever seen pictures of this, seriously, look up the Vanderbilt Estate. This thing is insane.
You can also go visit it.
Oh,
if
yeah.
You don't
yeah.
want to just Google it.
The University of California, Berkeley, Stanford University. He even designed the grounds of the United States Capitol building. The quality of his work was so big and recognized by his contemporaries that they would just shower him with all kinds of respect and praise. He was once quoted, or Burnham was once quoted as saying, "He paints with lakes and wooded slopes, with lawns and banks and forest-covered hills, with mountainsides and ocean views." Basically, he would take an empty plot of land and, much like a person creating a painting, would just turn the entire thing into a work of art. He would perform miracles with the different kinds of land. It was, people would liken what he would create to literally walking into a painting. You know, where everything just seems too good for what that actually is, like it's not natural.
Are there still people like that today?
I mean, yeah, you see on some of the things where they're designing, I think a prime example is when people build gardens for stuff, like not like gardens for growing vegetables. I'm talking about when a city builds a massive garden with walking paths and in ponds and all the different structures.
Yeah, that makes sense. That's what they do today.
He was the guy that really made that big and popularized it in America. Like, he's the one that really just showed how great of a thing that you could create. But of course, with every great thing that you need to do, you need a plan. But Burnham would, of course, say, make no little plans, because they have no magic to stir men's blood and probably themselves will not be realized. So you don't plan for anything small. You gotta go big. And so him and his team would work day and night, turning this massive network of marshes, lagoons, and everything into a complete new Chicago-style recreation of Venice. I mean, we're talking Venetian-style gondolas, brand new electric boats, waterways, everything. This was ridiculous. They created out of this landscape an entire Venetian lake system, or like river system, just for people to transport and for the style and for aesthetic. The largest feat that they accomplished became the centerpiece of the fair. What they had was something called the basin, right? And the basin was this massive man-made pond that was in the middle of the Court of Honor, which was the location with the most impressive buildings. Like, it was the biggest part of the fair, it was the center. And the basin featured something called the Statue of the Republic, which was this 65-foot tall woman that was holding a globe with a staff that represented liberty and discovery. And then on top of that, it was covered entirely in gold. So they gotta go big. And then around the statue, you had 6 huge white buildings, which were the manufactories, the liberal arts buildings, like all the different showcase rooms where the biggest, best stuff was gonna go.
I have a question. So the Statue of the Republic, was that before or after the Statue of Liberty?
At the time. Why am I drawing a blank on this? The Statue of Liberty came first.
From France, right?
Yes, it came from France. If I recall correctly, the Statue of Liberty was something like 15, 20 years earlier. This is going to bother me right now. Can you look up on your phone when was the Statue of Liberty installed? I swear it was like the 1870s or 1880s. It has to be recent. It was not in the 1900s. This is going to bother me so much if it was. I swear.
1876.
I called it 1870. I knew it. Okay. Thank God. Because that's off the top of your head. You asked me that. I'm like, I swear it was like 15 years earlier.
What, you mean you don't know everything?
Welcome to the history of everything. I say a lot of stuff, but I'm glad when you ask a question, naturally, that I can go in and be like, yes, got it. Anyway.
The largest building in the world.
The largest building in the world. Right. So this was the largest building in the world, clocking at 1,345,462 feet.
And that was the Manufacturers and Liberal Arts building?
Yeah, we're talking about something that was a skyscraper, right? This is huge.
So they built a one in 1890?
Gab, this is around the time of skyscrapers.
I mean, I know that, but it's just for a World's Fair. So is this city still around, or did they dismantle? It was just for the fair, right?
I mean, a number of the things were.
So do these buildings still exist?
Yeah, a couple of the buildings still exist. There were only a few of them that actually did, right? The majority of the buildings were temporary affairs, but some of them were built specifically to last, and that it was a big deal. So there was so much detail that went into this. I'll give you this as an example. Inside, when you walked in, the roof of the building, like the initial thing, was 246 feet just up in the air. It was just this massive open thing with this ridiculous amount of open space. And then inside of it had 5 massive electric chandeliers, which still were the largest ever built. Each chandelier was 75 feet in diameter. I want you to think about this. For anyone that doesn't understand.
There's 5 of those. I'm just trying to process that.
So I am not 6 feet. I am 5'11", right? So this, if I lay down on the floor, fully stretched out, a good 12 of me would fit inside one of these chandeliers. And there was 5 of them. And that's 12 of me in a line. So it's a massive circle. This had the equivalent of, you know how we have horsepower? 828,000 candle power. It was bright. This was huge. The choral building contained the world's largest choir, something like 2,500 singers going at the same time. It was ridiculous. The machinery hall was so loud with all of its engines and gears that most people simply could not handle actually going into it. They had to kind of witness it from a distance because everything within it would cause their ears to just go bad. It was the 1890s equivalent of attending a death metal concert with like the ears of a newborn child. It was bad. The horticultural hall contained 50,000 roses along with 1 million tulips. The electricity building powered all of over 1 million lights, which would light up the entire expo, which became known to the locals because of it as the White City. A new long-range telegraph line allowed the crowd in Chicago to hear a symphony being performed in a concert that was in New York. Like they were able to transmit the sound from this specifically for that production. I can't imagine that it actually sounded good because the technology hadn't really developed all that well to that point, but we're still talking about something that was a marvel to be able to hear anything from that great of a distance. You had people like Nikola Tesla who were there, amazing crowds. He did this whole thing where he would have electricity flow into one part of his body around it and then would use it then from his own body to cause a gas discharge lamp to shine. Like he was pulling off shit that
I would like to see that.
I know. It sounds so amazing. Thomas Edison lobbied that his DC power was actually superior. But what truly left the audience speechless was that when he held a new showing of the kinetoscope, the first ever public display of a motion picture.
That's really
television.
cool.
Like the first ever thing of like television and a projected moving image from what they would have for like an actual big public showing. This was the original drive-through, basically. Like it was the first big one. The fair was so large that Barnum had to go hire men from
Burnham. You said Barnum.
Wait, no, Barnum is the circus guy. Why did I say Barnum? I'm probably thinking of that. I should do the circus one too with Barnum because that's a whole other impressive thing.
Another one.
Burnham had hired men from the Pinkerton Detective Agency who, of course, they found themselves in such a situation that they needed to form a private police force known as the Columbian Guard, which I'm not going to lie, that actually sounds like a pretty cool name. It really does. And because of that ever-present security, the Exchange was actually one of the safest places in Chicago.
A few moments later.
Anyway, if you noticed a little bit of a cut right there in both the podcast and the YouTube video, that is because Gabby just had to do a series of shots to try and stay warm. Or like
it warms you up.
It doesn't. It doesn't actually make you warm.
It doesn't?
Wait, hold on. You didn't know that?
Oh, it just makes you feel warm. You're
Yeah,
still
it
very
makes you
close.
feel warm.
So
No, that's the
people
idea.
have actually died of hypothermia. I was just messing with
Oh,
you.
because in fact, you get hypothermia faster. For anyone who is not aware of this, if you still believe in like the myth that alcohol makes you warmer, it doesn't. It makes you feel warmer because it basically it opens up your pores more, like your blood vessels, everything. So you release more heat, which
you
makes you
think
feel
you're
warmer, but you're losing heat quicker.
Okay. Anyway, back where we were.
Anyway.
They hired a detective agency, so they formed the Columbian Guard.
Yes. So the fair was so large that Burnham had to go and hire men from the Pinkerton Detective Agency, and they formed their own private police force called the Columbian Guard. And as a result of that security, the place was the most safe of like any part of Chicago. Which, I mean, Chicago.
It's Chicago.
Nowadays. It's Chicago.
Love it.
So
but
saying that it's the safest part of Chicago is not necessarily saying much, but it really was the safest place that you could possibly be in Chicago. There was just that many guards that were around it. And so for a lot of people, like the young people in Chicago, this was the perfect place that they could find love.
that's really sweet, though.
Yeah. So there's this whole idea where, you know how You know how in the Victorian era you would see all that stuff where these marriages would be arranged, because you've watched the show, you've seen the different like courting shows, and they're being supervised by a chaperone and all this kind of stuff, and they're at the home, and there's not really much else that they can do, right? Well, in this place, in an era where all these strict social rules regarding dating and courting existed, this place with all of its lights became the perfect nighttime place that young couples could simply go for a stroll and perhaps find a dark corner to discuss their relationship further.
This is giving Christian college vibes.
This is giving Christian college vibes.
I can say that.
Yes,
I
it
went
is.
to Christian college.
And I can say it because I married a person who went to Christian college and told me all the stories from it.
Yay.
So at night, the White City was pretty much an otherworldly experience, right? This was something that was glowing. It was practically glowing because of the biggest spotlights in existence being focused on it. What fairgoers never really could have guessed is that the buildings were not actually made of marble, which is what it was like. They were instead made of a mix between stucco and plaster.
So they weren't built to last.
No, a bunch of the buildings were not. Some were. The majority were not, right? And so these things were made of a mix between stucco and plaster, and it would take a army of painters to go and try and paint all of that white, which then, when you had that combined with the lights, would give this otherworldly experience in the glow. But as a result from it, because it would take way too long to simply get rollers and paint all of this, it is because of this Chicago Fair that you would see the process of spray painting being invented.
Okay, that's really cool.
Like all these little things that you wouldn't really normally hear about or any of this other stuff, it specifically came into existence because of this fair.
Why don't we have more world fairs? I feel like nowadays it's just, I'm
do,
competing.
don't we?
When was the last world fair? I've never heard of one. I
Don't
want to
we?
go to one. This
I
sounds
swear
cool.
Can you look it up? I swear there is a world fair every year.
Okay, you
or every
continue
couple
with the
years.
story and I'll look up the world fair.
Look up. I do want to verify that because I'm pretty sure there are still world fairs. That is still a thing. It's just not necessarily as big of a deal as it otherwise would have been, right? So spray painting gets invented because of this. Of the more than 200 different buildings that they erected for this event, there are only 2 which stand to this day, that being the Palace of Fine Arts and the World's Congress Auxiliary Building. The fair also produced its own newspaper in order to try and keep visitors aware of all the different attractions that were opening or the events that were taking place on specific days, basically anything that would be occurring at that time, kind of like a like the TV guide or situation. Did you look it up?
I did look it up. Okay. So the most recent World Fair was a specialized expo in 2017 in Dubai.
Oh my God!
No, Kazakhstan held the most recent specialized expo.
I think I remember.
The United Arab Emirates hosted Expo 2020, which was postponed due to COVID-19. And then Buenos Aires, Argentina, they were supposed to host another one in 2023, but they announced their withdrawal with no rescheduled date. That's so disappointing. Come on. I wanted to go.
I wonder why that would happen. You know, Gabby, especially with us doing traveling, we might literally be able to do that at some point when it gets determined.
I don't have any PTO now. He's like, oh, with us doing more
traveling. Yeah, but in like 2024 or whenever it occurs or 2025, you know?
I still probably won't have any PTO.
Okay.
I never have PTO.
If you're watching this on YouTube, like, comment, and subscribe. Watch this thing through the entire thing to get ad revenue. If this one video, which is going to end up being like, or 2-part video is going to end up being like 2 or 3 hours long, if we put enough advertisements in it and 1 million people watch it, you can quit, okay? You can do it. Maybe. Share this around. Do whatever you can. Help us. I want to take my wife to the World Fair. Now, the whole thing with these countries hosting it, the entire reason for it is that all of this stuff is about the country that is hosting the World Fair showing off how great it is. And then the people that go, or the countries that attend the fair with their representatives, are there to show off their country. They're there to brag about the technology, about the military, the art, the agriculture, like any kind of thing that you could potentially brag about your country for. That is what is going on at a World Fair. That is the entire thing. So Burnham and his team were pretty much being assaulted by all these different offers from different countries, entertainers, inventors, private businesses, anyone who wanted to do anything with handling or doing stuff for a large event, because as you can imagine with something this huge, there was money to be made, like some serious money. Everyone wanted to be a part of the fair. They wanted to take some part. Some were denied fairly early on, which we're going to do a podcast episode about this here. But there was a case where, Buffalo Bill, right?
Okay, I didn't know Buffalo Bill was a real person.
Many people don't. A number of people think that Buffalo Bill was not actually a real person, that it was like one of the urban legends or folk stories or legends. No, Buffalo Bill, did I say Bill? Buffalo Bill was like a real dude, right? And so Buffalo Bill Cody was turned down. And the reason why he was turned down was because his show was deemed to be too low class to occur at such an event as the fair.
So Buffalo Bill just did shows.
I mean, Buffalo Bill was active in his younger years and then basically became a showman later on.
So he just brought the cowboy rodeo to life.
Pretty much.
That's really cool, actually. I like that.
Yeah. So the reason that he was turned down was because it was deemed to be too low class to feature at the fair. But Cody never wanted to actually back down from a challenge or someone telling him no. He instead said, screw you, and purchased a 16-acre lot directly across the street from the entrance of the fair. And over the course of the 6 months that the fair was active, he ran his own Wild West fair that was so popular that people genuinely thought in some cases that his was the actual fair. I mean, we're talking about something that was filled with performances.
So they thought it was the entire World's Fair.
Well, because remember, this whole point is about showing off how great America is and like Chicago. So some people who would be traveling from out of the country would think like, this is the fair. They're trying to show off how cool and amazing cowboys and stuff are.
Were they happy with it?
Yeah.
Did they like?
People loved it.
I would love it too, actually.
So he made an absolute killing. Like they were performing things like just different performances by Western heroes. They had different recreations of battles, whatnot, with Native Americans. Imagine something that was like the Wild West version of the Coliseum almost. Like for a show. It was.
I mean, that would be pretty cool.
It was pretty cool. They had the fastest lady in the land, Annie Oakley. And because he placed the entrance of his show near the main entrance of the expo, a lot of people mistakenly thought that his show was the entire fair. And they still loved it and were entertained.
That's what I'm saying.
So
I would love it.
So they didn't have one show. This wasn't one expo. This was like two different shows in the same spot now. So that it became even bigger. Now, many of the shows and the exhibits and everything else, they weren't ready on the fair's dedication day, which was October 21st, 1892. But the fair itself would not open to the public until May 1st, 1893. But that delay was due to, it was a really bad winter. You know how bad Chicago winters can be?
No, I don't know how bad Chicago
as a Trinidadian island girl, I can only imagine going to Chicago in the middle of winter.
The furthest north I will go during winter is right where I am, and it is still too cold.
As we sit here in our 20-degree garage. Yeah, it would get way colder up there. But that winter of the 1892 to 1893 was one of the harshest winters on record in Chicago. Like it was one of the harshest winters that had ever experienced. And so within a month or so, everything after that seemed to start to come together as nations would begin to show up and start to assert their own technological shows that they were going to be putting on, because this whole thing was going to symbolize that the 20th century was here, that it was a thing. We are starting it. Mind you, it's like 7 years early, but it's like this is the thing that is to kick off a brand new century. It's a big deal.
Think that we were too young to remember the kickoff of this century, but we'll be way dead by the time the next one starts? That is so sad.
Maybe, unless we go full bionic.
Okay, so we'll be dead, and we won't get to see it.
I mean, the oldest humans are like in their 118 or something here. We could potentially reach it. It's just not likely.
You think
No, I don't think that you would.
Okay,
And I wouldn't
good.
either because I know in the future exactly what I'm doing. I am plugging myself into a video game, Sword Art Online style, and I'm just letting myself live out the rest of my days.
You're gonna be the guy that's just fishing.
I'm going to be the guy that's just fishing. But in my
Sword Art.
case, it'll be something like, I don't know what it would be at the time, but maybe raising
Wait,
digital dragons.
You were talking about this. Wait, how do we get here?
Okay, we're talking about...
So sorry.
Don't know.
We are so sorry. It's been like an hour.
There's a lot of different tangents, right? So within a month, things really start to come together. This is the start of the future. That's how we got there. We were talking about the future. Weird thing for me to go into from that, but the main place where the countries here were going to be able to go in and show off their powers, their abilities, everything was going to be in the Great Exhibition halls.